Welcome to Mr. Nightmare. Tonight we pull back the curtain on a true story where power and arrogance collided in a moment of cold, calculated violence, forever scarring the American psyche. We begin on a sweltering summer day, a day that promised negotiation but delivered only dread. You see, this is not just about a missing man. It's about the terrifying realization that even the most untouchable figures can simply vanish when the wrong people decide they must. If you're old enough, you remember the feeling of 1975, a moment when the nation was tired of politics and trusting no one. And then there was Jimmy Hoffa. He wasn't just a union president, he was a kingmaker, a power broker who controlled the pensions of millions. His name alone could open doors in Washington and shake down businessmen in Detroit. He controlled the Teamsters, and by extension, he controlled a massive piece of the American economy. He was an emperor and his power was intoxicating, built on equal parts legitimate union work and pure, unadulterated intimidation. I had been covering organized labor for years and I'd seen men rise and fall, but never like Hoffa. He'd just finished a stint in federal prison, a small inconvenience, in his mind, and he was back full of fury and fueled by a blinding self-confidence. He saw his release not as a second chance but as a mandate to reclaim his throne. Hoffa's entire existence was a loud, defiant roar, and he expected the world to step aside. This immense stature, this apex of power, is precisely what made him so vulnerable. He believed the rules that governed ordinary men, rules about caution, about respect for the underworld's hierarchy, simply did not apply to him. He was operating under a fatal illusion of invincibility. His return to Detroit that summer wasn't a quiet re-entry. It was a challenge, a declaration of war against the mobsters who thought they had finally clipped his wings. Hoffa needed the Mafia, specifically the Detroit and New Jersey families, to get back control of the Teamsters. But he intended to deal with them from a position of strength, not submission. And that's what led him to arrange that fateful lunch. He was meeting Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone, two men you simply do not keep waiting. For Hoffa, this was a political maneuver. For the men on the other side of the table, this was an execution order disguised as an invitation. On the morning of July 30th, 1975, when Jimmy Hoffa walked out of his house, he wasn't just going to lunch. He was walking directly into the center of a well-baited trap, fueled by his own massive ego and a terrifying miscalculation of who truly held the power in the shadows. He believed he was negotiating his future, but he was merely confirming his fate. The decision to attend that lunch on July 30th, 1975, was not an act of negligence. It was an act of fatal arrogance. Jimmy Hoffa's mindset leading up to that meeting was the second and most critical vulnerability in his story. His surface truth, the narrative he constructed for himself, was simple. I am Jimmy Hoffa. I am indispensable. I can fix this. Hoffa's history was a testament to his toughness. He had risen from poverty to control a multi-billion-dollar union fund. He had literally faced down the federal government under Robert Kennedy and emerged battered, but unbroken. In his view, the few years he had spent in prison were not a punishment but a political inconvenience, a temporary pause in his reign. When he was released, he wasn't humbled, he was vengeful. He saw the leadership changes and the growing control the mob exerted over his beloved Teamsters as an intolerable personal insult. His need to reclaim the presidency was more than political. It was a psychological imperative. This psychological drive led him to a blind bargain. He knew the Mafia controlled the biggest levers of power within the Teamsters, and he knew they were furious that his return was complicating their lucrative deals. The men he was meeting, Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano from the Genovese crime family and Anthony Tony Giacalone from the Detroit partnership, were not negotiators. They were warlords. Provenzano, in particular, nursed a deep, boiling personal grudge against Hoffa, stemming from a humiliating argument they'd had years earlier. Any sane man would have sought neutral ground, demanded a mediator, or better yet, avoided the meeting entirely. But Hoffa operated under what I call the myth of the unseen shield. He genuinely believed that his status, his knowledge of the union's internal secrets, and his past political power afforded him an invisible layer of protection. He saw the meeting not as a confrontation, but as a mandatory step in his corporate takeover. He was going to use the meeting to remind them who built the Teamsters, who knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically at that point, and why they needed him back in charge to keep the massive pension fund flowing. He thought he held all the cards. This was his surface truth, a confident boss asserting his authority. This blind bargain was made despite repeated urgent warnings. I heard from sources close to Hoffa's legal team and his family, men who truly loved and feared for him, who recounted attempts to dissuade him. His son James P. Hoffa, who would later become Teamsters president himself, reportedly pleaded with him to be cautious, perhaps even to skip the Machus Red Fox appointment. The whispers from the outside were even louder. The FBI was passively warning anyone who would listen that Hoffa was in extreme danger. The message from the mob's side was clear. You interfere with our money, you pay the ultimate price. Yet Hoffa dismissed every warning as weakness or paranoia. When people urged caution, his response was often laced with his characteristic bravado. They wouldn't dare. They know too much. They know who I am. He believed the Mafia was bound by a certain logic, a code of self-preservation that precluded killing a figure as massive and as publicly known as himself. This was his most profound psychological flaw. He conflated his public status with personal safety. He thought his legend was his armor. The truth we know now is devastatingly simple. Hoffa was walking into a meeting where no negotiation was ever scheduled to take place. The Mafia was not interested in brokering power. They were interested in making an example. They had consolidated their control over the Teamsters' immense wealth while Hoffa was imprisoned, and his return was a dangerous, disruptive threat to their established income stream. His demand to reclaim the presidency was viewed not as a power play, but as a personal threat to their financial well-being. And in the underworld, when money and pride intersect, the conflict is always resolved with violence. Hoffa's vulnerability was his hubris. He approached the meeting as a business negotiation. They approached it as a permanent termination. He chose the time and place for what he thought would be a strong-armed comeback, completely misjudging the fact that his opponents viewed the situation as a perfect opportunity to impose the rule of eternal silence. Hoffa arrived believing he was about to set the terms of his return. In reality, he was about to sign his own death warrant with a handshake. The atmosphere at the Machus Red Fox restaurant on that scorching afternoon of July 30th was a bizarre blend of suburban calm and high-stakes tension. This wasn't some dark, smoky backroom. It was a brightly lit, popular establishment, known for its clientele of Detroit's middle class. This very normalcy, however, amplified the impending sense of dread for those of us tracking the situation. Jimmy Hoffa arrived, likely around 2 p.m., fully expecting to see Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone waiting at the table. He was going to sit down, assert his power, and start drawing the lines for his return. But the chairs were empty. This was the first, and perhaps most crucial tactical error made against Hoffa. They kept him waiting. For a man whose entire identity was built on punctuality, dominance, and demanding immediate respect, being stood up was not merely an inconvenience, it was a profound psychological insult, a deliberate power play. Hoffa was not the kind of man to patiently sip iced tea and wait. His impatience would have been a palpable, simmering rage. Every minute that ticked by would have eroded the last sliver of his belief that he was still in control of the situation. This waiting game was designed to soften him, to disarm his legendary temper, and most importantly, to isolate him. The critical moment came at 2:30 p.m. Hoffa, exasperated and increasingly nervous, did what any frustrated boss would do. He reached for the phone. This was not a call to his lawyers or the union security. This was a personal check-in with his wife, Josephine. This conversation, brief and seemingly routine, is the Omen, the final crystal-clear warning signal of the unfolding catastrophe. He was trying to maintain a facade of control, but the panic was seeping into his voice. The known details of that final call are chilling in their simplicity, yet they carry the full weight of the tragedy. He told Josephine, "They stood me up. Tony G hasn't shown. I'll be home late." But it was the subtext, the tone, and the single unspoken realization in Hoffa's mind that mattered most. The mob had breached the primary rule of negotiation: show up. Their failure to appear was not an organizational failure. It was a strategic move. It validated the fear that this was never about business. Here, The narrative hinges on the crucial analysis of the dialogue. The sentence, "They stood me up," carries layers of meaning. It means I am angry, I am insulted, and my authority has been questioned. But to someone who lived and breathed the mob's code, it means something far worse. The terms have changed. I am no longer an equal. Hoffa, who understood power dynamics better than anyone, recognized the shift from negotiation to execution. His call wasn't just an update. It was an instinctive recognition that he was dangerously exposed. He was alone, vulnerable, and broadcasting his location and his frustration directly to the people who were monitoring his every move. Crucially, in some accounts, Hoffa is said to have added a haunting codicil to that brief conversation, a statement that elevated the call from a simple check-in to a final message, a testament of dread. If I don't get back on time, just know they didn't let me go. This single line is the core of the Omen. It confirms that by 2:30 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa knew his life was in immediate terminal danger. He was acknowledging that his destiny was no longer his own. It was in the hands of the forces he had so arrogantly challenged. It was his final, quiet admission that his myth of the unseen shield had failed. What happened next is a matter of conjecture, built on fragmented testimony, but the timeline suggests the meeting was quickly hijacked. We believe that shortly after the call, perhaps between 2:45 p.m. and 3:00 p.m., a car carrying one or two trusted associates arrived. This could have been Frank Sheeran, Hoffa's longtime friend and alleged killer, or another low-profile driver. They would have used the perfect cover, familiarity. Someone Hoffa knew and trusted would have easily convinced him to leave the parking lot, citing a last-minute change of venue due to Tony G's unforeseen delay. Hoffa, eager to resolve the issue and salvage his dignity after the public slight, would have willingly entered that car. The final image of the Omen is Hoffa's dark blue Pontiac Grand Ville, sitting abandoned in the parking lot. By 3:00 p.m. the car was still there, but the man who drove it was gone. The simple act of the empty car, coupled with that single desperate phone call, created the perfect, horrifying setup for the crime of the century. Hoffa was lured from public view, not by strangers with guns, but by the quiet certainty of betrayal. The final words he spoke, words of impatience and fear, sealed his fate and began the clock on the most agonizing unsolved mystery in American history. The stage was now set for the total eradication of any physical evidence. The evening of July 30th melted into the early hours of the 31st, and the silence around Jimmy Hoffa was no longer tense, it was deafening. The initial anxiety shared by his wife, Josephine, and his children, James and Barbara, quickly escalated into full-blown panic. Josephine, having received that haunting final call, knew intrinsically that something was grievously wrong. But the public, the media, and even law enforcement were locked in the most dangerous phase of any true crime investigation, the rationalization phase. This psychological barrier prevents people from accepting the most terrifying truth, opting instead for comforting, logical but ultimately incorrect scenarios. For the first 12 hours, the narrative was driven by Hoffa's immense reputation. Jimmy's pulled a stunt before. He's avoiding a subpoena. He's gone underground to organize a secret political maneuver. This line of thinking was the default defense mechanism. The man was a master manipulator, a strategic genius who thrived on secrecy. It was easy to believe his absence was just another massive high-stakes game. The FBI, forced to open a missing persons case, was initially cautious, almost dismissive. They didn't want to be embarrassed by declaring the most powerful labor figure in America missing, only for him to show up smugly on the steps of the Teamsters headquarters the next morning. They maintained the facade of routine, but behind closed doors, the frantic, desperate search had already begun. The media played a significant role in perpetuating this denial. Reporters descended upon Detroit, seeking confirmation of any normal explanation. Was he with a mistress? Was he hiding in a Teamster safe house? Every normal human flaw was examined as a potential cover story for his disappearance. This frenzy of speculation served a vital psychological purpose for the public. It kept the mob out of the conversation. To accept that Jimmy Hoffa had simply been erased by the Mafia was to accept a fundamental and terrifying truth about the limits of American law and order. It was easier to believe Hoffa was a rogue operator than to believe the Mafia possessed the power to make an icon vanish. The entire system, political, social, and legal, was collectively trying to normalize the abnormal. This self-deception began to crumble when the police released the first few findings from the Machus Red Fox parking lot. The key detail was the discovery of the car itself, the pristine dark blue Pontiac. If Hoffa had run, he would have taken the car. If he was kidnapped by amateurs looking for ransom, they would have disposed of the car hundreds of miles away. The deliberate, visible placement of the vehicle was the first tangible piece of evidence that defied rationalization. The car was a message, a visual declaration of control. The internal police report started whispering the word professional. This was no spontaneous act of violence. It was a scheduled termination. Furthermore, the mob's reaction to the inquiry was the second major factor dissolving the rationalizations. The traditional mob response to a high-profile inquiry is loud, intimidating denial, or subtle misdirection. In Hoffa's case, the reaction from the Giacalones and Provenzano was an eerie, unified wall of silence. They offered no assistance, no public statements of surprise, and no indignation. They were stone cold. This lack of public panic from the mob was more terrifying than any threat. It signaled a profound confidence that the job was complete, clean, and irreversible. This was the first time many investigators truly understood that the man they were looking for was no longer a person of interest, but a victim of a calculated power play. The psychological impact on the Hoffa family and on those close to the Teamsters was devastating. The hope that he was just hiding for strategic reasons faded into the cold reality that he was likely dead. For those in the Teamsters union, the initial shock gave way to a deeper, more profound fear. If Hoffa, the giant, could be extinguished so swiftly and silently, what hope did any of them have? The union suddenly faced an internal crisis of leadership and an external crisis of morale. The rationalizations that had protected the system for decades, the mob only targets its own, they never cross the line this publicly, were proven to be dangerous lies. The Mafia had crossed the line and done so with such stunning efficiency that it paralyzed the very people charged with fighting them. By the 48-hour mark, the missing person report had transformed into a homicide investigation without a body. The FBI had finally shed its denial, concluding that the only explanation that fit the evidence, the abandoned car, the lack of struggle, the absolute silence from the targets, was that Hoffa had been executed by the most ruthless and professional element of organized crime. The investigation had moved past the question of why and was now desperately trying to answer where and how they had managed to erase a man of such stature so completely. The rationalizations had failed, leaving behind only the cold, hard, terrifying truth. The rationalizations had failed. By the third day, the FBI's official stance had hardened from missing person to presumed murder victim. The investigation, however, wasn't stuck in a labyrinth of physical evidence. It was trapped behind an invisible, impenetrable wall, omerta. This was the mob's sacred code, their promise of eternal silence and absolute non-cooperation with authorities, enforced by the chilling threat of violent retribution. It wasn't just fear. It was a psychological infrastructure that protected the entire criminal underworld. For those of us trying to piece the truth together from the outside, the shift was immediate and terrifying. Every single potential witness, every low-level associate, every Teamsters official with known mob ties, they all developed a sudden, overwhelming case of convenient amnesia. Their eyes glazed over, their voices dropped to monotone denials, and their language became frustratingly circular. They didn't deny the crime. They simply denied its existence. This wasn't incompetence. It was a deeply effective defense mechanism. We were running into a void, trying to interrogate a silence that was louder and more powerful than any confession. My personal strategy, informed by years of tracking this shadow government, was to bypass the official channels. I went cold, leveraging decades-old favors and connections with men who had retired or been sidelined. Men who, despite their detachment, still knew the price of breaking the code. The search led me to an old source we called the Ghost. He was a seasoned associate of the New Jersey crew, a man who had seen too much violence to fear the police but who still respected the power structure. He was always quiet, always discreet, and most importantly, always a difficult target. I finally managed to corner him on a secure public phone line in a distant, nondescript diner. the kind of place where surveillance was difficult and everyone minded their own business. The atmosphere was thick with tension, even across the miles. I spoke first, my voice tight. "Jimmy Hoffa, I need to know where he is. I need something real, something more than the silence." There was a long, painful pause on his end. I could hear the faint sound of clattering dishes and background chatter, a normal world oblivious to the darkness we were discussing. The ghost didn't initially answer the question. Instead, he challenged my right to ask it, a grim testament to the code. "You still asking about that noise, huh? You know the rules, kid. Some things, they just go away. You gotta accept that." I pushed back, pressing on the public nature of the disappearance, arguing the Mafia had gone too far. That's when his voice dropped to a low, chilling, gravelly whisper, finally confirming my deepest fears with words that were instantly code. He spoke with a chilling finality, a detached acceptance of brutality that was far more frightening than open rage. "Hoffa, he ain't late, kid. He's on a long vacation now, permanent camping. You understand? He's in God's country now, and you should stop asking about the furniture. The delivery was made, the receipt was signed, and the business is closed. You keep digging and you're just going to make more noise for yourself, and the mob doesn't like noise. Now put the phone down and forget you ever called." The line went dead immediately, leaving me alone with the ringing in my ears and the full, horrifying weight of his statement. This was the first true evidence we had. It wasn't physical. It was linguistic. Every phrase was code, but every code word pointed to the same single, inescapable conclusion: assassination and disposal. We immediately broke down the language. Permanent camping and God's country, euphemisms for death and burial, often suggesting a quick, remote, and difficult-to-find gravesite. But the phrase that solidified the mob's sheer, cold control was, "Stop asking about the furniture." In the criminal argot of that time, the furniture was often used to refer to the non-essential or disposable items left after an incident, or, in the most macabre context, the body itself. The message was terrifyingly simple. The physical problem, Hoffa, has been removed. Don't concern yourself with the remains. The next sentence added to the brutality. The delivery was made. The receipt was signed and the business is closed. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a transaction. Hoffa's murder was a business decision, executed, finalized, and logged. The receipt, in this context, was the permanent silence that followed. This dialogue was the first chink in the armor of Omerta, but it was delivered with such a profound warning that it also reinforced the code's power. The ghost gave us the truth, but he did it to protect himself and to issue a terrifying edict to the outside world. The case is closed. Do not reopen it. This cryptic confirmation was the moment the FBI moved beyond conjecture. The investigation now shifted from searching for a living, bargaining tool to hunting for a disposal site and an executioner. The ghost's whisper was the direct link between the clean car, Part 6, and the revelation of the trap, Part 7. It told us that the mob's involvement was not just peripheral, it was total, calculated, and absolute. The Omerta had spoken, and its words were colder than any concrete burial. The discovery of the Pontiac Grand Ville was, paradoxically, the moment hope died and the nightmare began. When Jimmy Hoffa's car was found abandoned in the Machus Red Fox parking lot, it should have been a goldmine of physical evidence. A high-profile kidnapping or violent altercation should leave traces: scuff marks, smudges of mud, a stray hair, or, most crucially, a chaotic array of fingerprints belonging to the abductors. What the FBI forensics team actually found, however, was far more chilling than any bloodstain. They found a void. The car was clean, too clean. It had been meticulously sterilized as if prepared for a showroom floor, not abandoned in a desperate criminal getaway. I remember talking to the lead forensic technician on the case, a veteran who had seen everything from petty larceny to brutal homicides. He described the process with a sense of utter, bewildered frustration. They meticulously dusted every surface: the steering wheel, the door handles, the glove box, and even the interior dash. Hoffa, being Hoffa, would have naturally left his own prints, and those of his family were expected. Beyond that, the expected chaos of an abduction, the fleeting contact of hands on the doorframe, the frantic grip on the passenger seat, was non-existent. It was almost surgical, the agent told me. We found no foreign prints that could be positively identified, no defensive wounds traced in the interior, and no signs of a physical struggle whatsoever. It was like the final scene had been vacuumed out of existence. This absence of evidence was, in itself, the most damning evidence against an amateur operation. A panicked criminal leaves chaos. A professional organized hit team leaves order. The clean car screamed two vital truths at the investigators. First, the killer was not panicked. They were methodical, efficient, and had the time and expertise to erase their presence. Second, the victim did not fight back inside the car. This suggested that Hoffa either knew his killer and willingly went with them, or he was so expertly surprised, perhaps with a quick, brutal blow, that the struggle was over before it began, or it took place outside the vehicle before he was placed inside. The analysis of the cleaning materials, which was attempted, only deepened the mystery. They found trace elements consistent with standard industrial cleaning agents, suggesting the car was not just wiped with a sleeve, but subjected to a thorough professional detailing. This level of care implies a team effort and a cold, strategic commitment to silence. The Mafia didn't just assassinate a man. They performed a theatrical visual demonstration of their power to erase history. They presented the car as a symbol. Here is the body of the crime, but the identity of the criminal is untouchable. The visual signature of the clean Pontiac served as a physical confirmation of the cryptic message delivered by The Ghost, Part 5. The words, "The delivery was made, the receipt was signed," were physically manifested in that sterile, empty vehicle. The car itself became a chilling metaphor for Hoffa's fate. He had been taken, processed, and removed without leaving the slightest physical proof of the act within the vehicle that took him away. This detail immediately redirected the FBI's focus from tracking down a chaotic crime scene to attempting to penetrate the inner workings of the mob's disposal network. They understood they were dealing with men who had done this before, men who viewed human life as simply another object to be efficiently removed. The very cleanliness of the Pontiac meant investigators had to expand their search parameters drastically. They were now looking for burial sites, not crash sites. They were looking for places where concrete was poured, not where bullets were fired. The psychological toll on the investigators was enormous. The crime was so bold, so public, yet its physical manifestation was so elusive. That car, sitting abandoned under the summer sun, became a mocking monument to the Mafia's untouchable power. It told them, "We are smarter than you, we are cleaner than you, and we are absolutely beyond your reach." The cleaned Pontiac was not just evidence. It was a psychological weapon designed to paralyze the justice system with the sheer, arrogant perfection of the cover-up. The most damning evidence in the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was literally the absence of any. The discovery of the meticulously cleaned Pontiac, Part 6, and the chilling coded message from the underworld, Part 5, confirmed what happened: murder. But the investigation's true turning point came when we finally pieced together the movements of the alleged attendees, revealing the shocking how the meeting was a lie. The central pillar of the supposed negotiation was the attendance of Anthony "Tony" Giacalone. He was the powerhouse of the Detroit crime family, and his presence was the guarantee that Hoffa thought he needed for the meeting to be legitimate. Yet when investigators finally managed to crack the wall of silence around Giacalone's movements that afternoon, a process that involved immense pressure, wiretaps, and leveraging unrelated arrests, they uncovered a truth far darker than simple tardiness. Tony Giacalone was never going to be at the Machus Red Fox. Giacalone had constructed an alibi as rigid and impenetrable as a fortress. He was miles away from the restaurant, attending a series of carefully arranged social engagements with high-profile, legitimate businessmen, lawyers, and political figures. These were not the usual mob associates. They were pillars of the community whose testimony would stand up in any court of law. This meticulously built alibi served a dual purpose. It protected Giacalone from direct involvement, and it confirmed that the entire premise of the meeting, the surface truth Hoffa believed, Part 2, was a masterful, deadly fabrication. The realization was a gut punch to the FBI. Hoffa had walked into that parking lot believing he was dealing with the volatile, unpredictable pride of Tony Provenzano, but he failed to see the quiet, calculated menace of Tony Giacalone operating entirely in the background. The meeting was a Trojan horse. It was engineered not to bring the two sides together, but to lure the target to a precise, isolated spot at a precise time. under the cover of a routine business engagement. The entire purpose of the delay, that infuriating 25 minutes Hoffa spent waiting and calling his wife, part 3, was to ensure he was sufficiently agitated and alone when the real extraction team arrived. This was the terrifying psychological breakthrough. Hoffa's disappearance wasn't a kidnapping that escalated. It was a pre-planned, calculated termination. The moment Hoffa entered the parking lot, the die was cast. The true orchestrated trap was the simple, perfect misdirection that convinced a man who was paranoid about everything to trust the one thing that would kill him: his own schedule. The fictionalized narrative now turns to the chilling speculation of Hoffa's final moments of realization. He likely entered the car, driven by a trusted face like Frank Sheeran or Chucky O'Brien, under the pretext that they were driving to a secret location nearby where Giacalone was waiting. It was only when the car deviated from the expected route, or when the man he thought was his friend turned silent and grim, that the horrifying truth would have crashed down on him. Imagine the moment of clarity, the realization that the betrayal ran deeper than just business. It was personal, total, and irreversible. The power broker, the man who controlled millions, was now utterly helpless, trapped by his own massive ego and the lethal efficiency of the silent organization he had underestimated. The orchestrated trap revealed that the mob's goal was not money or negotiations. It was restoration of absolute control. Hoffa was a symbol of chaos, and his removal was a spectacular, necessary act of re-establishing order in the underworld. By making the public meeting the trap, they ensured that the disappearance would be instantly linked to the Mafia, delivering the warning, yet remaining untouchable due to the clean evidence and the ironclad alibis. The true genius of the crime lay in the fact that Hoffa, the ultimate master of the double-cross, was defeated by the oldest trick in the book: betrayal under the guise of friendship. This realization turned the FBI's investigation definitively away from missing person to homicide. The focus was no longer on tracking a kidnapping ring, but on dissecting the cold, hard process of assassination. The search shifted to understanding the methods of disposal, knowing that the man who drove the car, the man Hoffa trusted, held the key to the location of the body. The stage was set for the painful, years-long confrontation with the very code of silence that made this audacious plot possible. The realization that the Hoffa disappearance was an orchestrated trap, Part 7, immediately changed the investigation from a complex search operation into a full-scale war. But this was a war unlike any the Federal Bureau of Investigation had ever truly fought. They were not battling visible organized crime, the bookmakers, the loan sharks, the illicit liquor runners. They were battling an ideology, a culture, a system of existential fear known simply as omerta. This was the crisis point, the moment of truth where the full, immense power of the United States justice system was brought to bear against a void, and in the early agonizing years, the void was winning. The essence of the crisis lay in the complete absence of a body, combined with the Mafia's unbreakable psychological defense mechanism. Without a physical corpse, the charges against suspects like Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone remained frustratingly circumstantial, resting on the flimsy threads of association and the testimony of unreliable, fear-stricken low-level informants. The FBI knew who did it and they knew why, but knowing was utterly useless. They possessed the smoking gun in the form of circumstantial evidence, the cleaned car, the false alibi, but they lacked the crucial, smoking corpse required for a viable indictment. The mob had perfected the crime. The psychological toll on the federal agents was immense. These were professionals, trained to find tangible evidence, yet they were repeatedly confronted by a wall of willful, coordinated ignorance. Every subpoena served was met with a blank stare, every interrogation with a dismissive, "I have no idea what you're talking about, agent." The mob's highly paid, sophisticated lawyers were equally effective, coaching every potential witness to remain silent or to feign memory loss that was patently false. It was an audacious collective middle finger to the rule of law. The pressure mounted daily, turning the hunt for Hoffa's body into an all-consuming obsession that consumed entire FBI field offices across Detroit, New York, and New Jersey. The tactics of the void were simple but brutally effective. The mob created an impenetrable human shield. Any potential witness who might have had a scrap of information, a passing conversation, A strange truck, a shovel purchase, or an overheard whisper was silenced by the threat of swift absolute retribution. The FBI's desperate efforts to flip witnesses were largely catastrophic failures. They discovered that the fear of being marked by the Mafia, the paralyzing fear of the mob's eternal silence, far outweighed the physical protection offered by the federal government's Witness Protection Program. The mob's executioners were perceived as more reliable, more relentless, and ultimately, more terrifying than the FBI's promises. This desperate search for the truth led to a frustrating, years-long parade of investigative efforts. Firstly, the grand jury showdowns. The government convened multiple grand juries, forcing dozens of mob associates to testify under oath, hoping to break the psychological chain of silence. The result was a parade of witnesses who repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment or committed blatant, unpunished perjury. One memorable incident involved a mob enforcer who, when asked to identify a simple picture of Tony Provenzano, simply stared at the photograph for 5 minutes before stating flatly, "I have never seen that man in my life." The sheer, brazen arrogance was sickening, but legally, the FBI was rendered nearly powerless, unable to prove the perjury was related to the core crime. Secondly, the archaeological digs. Following every vague tip, some remotely credible, many utterly spurious, the FBI launched massive, highly publicized digging operations. They excavated fields in Michigan, meticulously scoured massive landfills, and even famously dug up a portion of a New Jersey stadium rumored to be the burial site. These highly public, desperate acts did little more than amplify the mob's psychological triumph. Every failed dig was a media spectacle that confirmed the terrifying message to the public and the Justice Department alike. You can look all you want. You will never find him. The digging became the literal physical manifestation of the FBI's desperation, a futile attempt to fill the horrifying void with a tangible truth. The effort was both necessary and humiliating. Thirdly, the wiretapping and surveillance blitz. The government invested tens of millions into round-the-clock surveillance and wiretapping of every known mob boss and associate involved in the case. Yet the mobsters, aware of the intense scrutiny following the crime of the century, only spoke in heavily coded language or refused to discuss business over the phone, limiting their sensitive conversations to walk-and-talks in remote locations or silent, ominous hand signals. The thousands of hours of transcripts were filled with mundane discussions of family, food, and sports, while the knowledge of Hoffa's exact location remained safely locked in the human minds committed to omerta. The true crisis was the realization that the rule of law operates on transparency and evidence, and the Mafia operates on absolute secrecy and terror. The Hoffa case proved beyond a doubt that when a criminal organization is sufficiently disciplined and ruthless, it can effectively render the most sophisticated justice system entirely impotent. The crisis wasn't about finding a killer. It was about the fundamental integrity of the American justice system itself, which was being ruthlessly mocked daily by the very men it sought to control. I remember the crushing weight of that time in the investigation. The veteran investigators, men I knew to be brilliant and relentless, began to show profound signs of psychological burnout. They were fighting a ghost, a perfectly executed crime that offered no physical handhold, no conventional lead. The crisis became a deep existential drain, forcing them to confront the terrifying notion that some crimes simply cannot be solved, not because of a lack of effort, but because the opposing force, the rule of eternal silence, was simply more powerful, more disciplined, and more deeply entrenched than the federal government was prepared to admit. Hoffa's disappearance had metastasized into a symbol of the mob's untouchable invincibility, and until that symbol was irrevocably broken, the crisis would continue to define the case. The Wall of Omerta, Part 8, though seemingly impenetrable, contained a flaw common to all human constructs: guilt. For decades, the silence held firm, turning the Hoffa case into an embarrassing unsolved scar on the FBI's record. The breakthrough, the ultimate revelation that we had desperately sought, did not come from forensic science or tactical surveillance. It came from a source steeped in the very code of violence that protected the killers. It came from Frank the Irishman Sheeran. Sheeran was a towering figure in the Philadelphia mob and, crucially, Jimmy Hoffa's most trusted personal enforcer. Their relationship was one of deep shared history, political maneuvering, and quiet understanding. He was the man Hoffa relied on to handle the dirty work, the man who was meant to be Hoffa's shield. He was literally the Judas of this narrative. It was years later, facing his own mortality and shielded by the protection of law enforcement, after his role in other organized crime matters, that Sheeran finally decided to break the silence that had protected the true killers for so long. His confession, though controversial and debated by some investigators, provided the missing link and the devastating emotional climax of the story. Sheeran confirmed the entire plot was a lethal setup. He admitted to being one of the men who picked Hoffa up at the Machus Red Fox, easily convincing his trusting friend to enter a waiting car. This part of the confession vividly exposes the depth of Hoffa's fatal flaw. His trust in a known associate outweighed all the warnings. Sheeran and two other mob associates drove Hoffa not to a new negotiation site, but to a seemingly innocuous low-profile house in Detroit, a designated killing ground secured by the mob. The moment of truth, the revelation that shattered Hoffa's world, likely occurred as they entered the house. Sheeran described how Hoffa realized instantly, with a visceral, gut-wrenching jolt, that the location was wrong, and the company was deadly. The air was heavy with unspoken violence. Hoffa, the man who had controlled every room he entered, was now cornered, his immense power reduced to a futile burst of human rage. Imagine that final, chilling confrontation. Hoffa, the fighter, likely didn't plead, he roared. He would have turned on Sheeran, demanding an explanation, relying on the years of shared loyalty. But Sheeran, already committed to his assignment by the higher powers of the mob, delivered the final crushing dialogue of betrayal. Accounts vary, but the sentiment remains devastatingly consistent. Jimmy, they're never letting you back in. They sent me to handle this. This was not just a threat. It was a psychological dismemberment. Hoffa was not killed for money. He was killed because his pride interfered with the organization's money. The final action, according to Sheeran, was swift and brutal. Hoffa, shocked and turning away, perhaps in disbelief or sudden cold rage, presented his back. And that's when Sheeran ended the confrontation. 3 quick cold shots to the back of Hoffa's head delivered at point-blank range. This was an execution, designed to be quick, efficient, and most importantly, irreversible. The simplicity and brutality of the act highlight the cold indifference of the Mafia. Hoffa, the man who could hold the country hostage, was dispatched like an inconvenient piece of trash. The revelation provided by Sheeran was a moment of intense satisfaction for the long-suffering FBI agents, yet it was tinged with profound ethical darkness. The man who had been Hoffa's shield was, in the end, his executioner. This shocking personal betrayal elevates the story beyond simple true crime and into the realm of classical tragedy. The man Hoffa trusted most was the weapon wielded by his enemies. The confession also provided critical details about the disposal, that the body was allegedly transported in the trunk of a car and later secretly buried, possibly compacted and potentially mixed into concrete at a distant location. While Sheeran's story shifted over the years regarding the exact burial site, his account of the killing itself and the betrayal remains the most accepted, horrifying truth about Jimmy Hoffa's final moments. The crisis was solved, not by justice prevailing, but by a killer's belated self-serving confession. The confession from Frank the Irishman Sheeran, Part 9, was the revelation the FBI had desperately needed, providing the who and the how of Hoffa's final moments. It was the crucial piece of the puzzle that broke the psychological stranglehold of Omerta. The Bureau finally had a pathway to justice, but they immediately faced a monumental, terrifying truth. They still had no body. This absence created a unique legal nightmare, turning the Hoffa case into a paradox, a widely known, confessed murder that was, for all intents and purposes, the unsolvable crime. The government's immediate survival action was twofold. First, to leverage Sheeran's testimony to finally pursue indictments against the mob figures involved, primarily Anthony Provenzano and others. Second, to launch the most massive, desperate search operation for the body. Hoping to turn the confession into a physical conviction, the FBI understood that even with Sheeran's sworn word, a Mafia lawyer could tear apart his credibility in court, given his history and the years-long inconsistencies in his accounts. They needed physical, undeniable evidence, Jimmy Hoffa's remains. The search efforts that followed Sheeran's confession were an astonishing spectacle of federal power and futility. Sheeran provided various possible locations over the years. an attempt to mislead, or perhaps his own genuine confusion about the disposal process. The most sensational theory was that Hoffa's body had been compressed into a steel drum, transported to New Jersey, and buried beneath the concrete foundation of Giants Stadium while it was under construction. The FBI, under intense public and political pressure to deliver closure, had no choice but to follow the lead. I recall the circus surrounding the stadium dig. It was a massive public display of frustration. Digging up the end zone of a major professional sports arena was unprecedented, but every inch of concrete excavated, every shovel full of dirt turned over, yielded nothing. The search was a symbolic act of defiance against the mob's code, but it ultimately served as a painful, public confirmation of their perfection. The mob had ensured that their victim was not just killed, but absorbed into the urban landscape, forever out of reach of the law. The legal crisis quickly became apparent. In the American justice system, while murder can be proven without a body based on overwhelming circumstantial evidence and confession, trying to secure a conviction against powerful, well-defended mob bosses on the word of a single, compromised informant was a colossal risk. The defense lawyers argued relentlessly, "Where is the victim? Where is the murder weapon? Mr. Sheeran is a desperate, habitual liar looking for a reduced sentence." The absence of the body was the mob's final, perfect weapon. The ultimate survival action taken by the government, therefore, was to shift focus. They knew they could not pin the murder of Hoffa directly onto the top bosses without physical evidence. Instead, the focus broadened to use the information gained during the Hoffa investigation, the wiretaps, the surveillance, and the indirect testimony, to prosecute the mob leaders on RICO violations, corruption, and other organized crime activities. This was a tactical retreat. If they couldn't get the conviction for the murder, they would dismantle the very power structure that allowed the murder to occur. The Hoffa case taught the federal government a brutal, expensive lesson. Justice is contingent upon tangibility. When faced with an enemy disciplined enough to commit physical erasure, the legal system falters. The murder itself remained legally unsolvable in the conventional sense. No one was ever convicted for the actual crime of killing Jimmy Hoffa, and those who organized it were rarely brought to justice directly because of the rule of eternal silence, which the mob bought with the perfect disposal of the evidence. Hoffa's final fate was to become the subject of the biggest, most frustrating legal paradox in history, a man who died, but whose death could not be legally proven. This agonizing lack of final legal resolution ensured that the legacy of Hoffa would be permanently tied to this unresolved absence. Part 11. The mob's final cold victory was ensuring that the law could never truly close the book on Jimmy Hoffa. The story of Jimmy Hoffa reached its legal conclusion in a state of agonizing permanent limbo. Part 10. No one was convicted for his murder, and the powerful men who orchestrated his demise largely escaped direct justice for that specific crime. But the true end of the story is not found in court records. It is found in the legacy he left behind, a legacy defined entirely by his absence, the enduring void. Hoffa's vanishing act was more than just a successful mob hit. It was a masterful exercise in psychological warfare that profoundly reshaped the American landscape. The disappearance served as the ultimate chilling public service announcement from the underworld. If we can make a man of Hoffa's stature vanish without a trace, imagine what we can do to you. This single act achieved what decades of threats and violence could not. It permanently instilled the fear of the mob into the hearts of union leaders, politicians, and businessmen across the country. His absence was their most effective weapon, a perpetual, silent threat that lasted for generations. The enduring void had two major, lasting consequences. Firstly, the collapse of union power. Hoffa's strongman, autonomous leadership style disappeared with him. The Teamsters union, once a monolithic, almost unstoppable force, fractured. Hoffa's successors were either weaker, more easily controlled by the mob, or forced to comply with federal oversight to clean up the corruption the mob had facilitated. The Mafia had successfully decapitated the union's powerful independent spirit, allowing them to continue siphoning millions from the pension funds without Hoffa's interference. His removal was the key event that fundamentally weakened the power of organized labor in America for decades to come. Secondly, the birth of American mythology. Because the body was never recovered, the case transcended true crime and entered the realm of urban legend. The void where Hoffa should have been was instantly filled by speculation, rumor, and fantastical theories. Every conspiracy theory was a desperate attempt by the public psyche to fill that terrifying emptiness. Was he mixed into the foundation of a bridge? Buried deep beneath a New Jersey landfill? Encased in the concrete of Giant Stadium? These were not just theories. They were a collective coping mechanism, a way to place the terrifying unknown into a specific, tangible location, even if that location was macabre. The mystery itself became Hoffa's permanent monument. The legacy also impacted the very way the FBI and other federal agencies approached organized crime. The painful realization of their impotence against Omerta led directly to more aggressive, systemic, and successful strategies, most notably the widespread use of the RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. If they couldn't prosecute the mob for murder due to the lack of a body, they would use financial and systemic crimes to cripple the entire organization. In this sense, Hoffa's ultimate, unintended legacy was to provide the political and moral justification necessary for the government to finally declare all-out war on the mob's infrastructure. For the Hoffa family, the void was a source of unrelenting anguish. The lack of a body meant there was no grave to mourn over, no final closure, no undeniable proof of death that could silence the perpetual whispers and conspiracy theories. His disappearance ensured that their pain would be a public spectacle, endlessly re-examined and theorized upon. The unresolved nature of the case meant that Jimmy Hoffa, the public figure, would never truly rest. The enduring void is the mob's final, cold, masterful victory. They demonstrated that sometimes the most effective way to eliminate an enemy is not just to kill them, but to erase them completely. They managed to turn the lack of evidence into the most compelling evidence of their own invincible discipline. Hoffa's disappearance serves as a permanent, chilling fixture in American history, an unsolved case that embodies the ruthless intersection of ambition, betrayal, and the terrifying cold power of silence. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa is more than a single crime. It is a profound historical document detailing the absolute nature of power and the terrifying price of betrayal. We have meticulously tracked the narrative from Hoffa's hubristic confidence, Part 2, that led him into the Orchestrated Trap, Part 7, through the shocking revelation of his murder by his own confidant, Frank Sheeran, Part 9. His legacy is not his immense power, but the permanent void, Part 11, he left behind. A terrifying testament to the Mafia's discipline. The verdict of history is unambiguous. Hoffa was a brilliant, relentless figure who was defeated not by law enforcement, but by his own fatal arrogance and the superior efficiency of organized crime. He believed he was indispensable, and the Mafia with clinical precision proved that everyone, even a figure of his massive stature, is disposable. His ambition, once his greatest strength, became his ultimate weakness, leading him to ignore every warning sign, every cryptic message, and every chilling whisper from the underworld. The true antagonist in this entire saga was never a single gunman or mob boss, but the systemic terror imposed by the rule of eternal silence, Omerta. The mob managed to turn the lack of evidence, the unsolvable crime, Part 10, into their final permanent victory. They ensured that the final conclusive proof of the murder would forever remain out of the law's reach, allowing the myth, the fear, and the powerful message of their untouchability to endure for generations. Hoffa's body was not just disposed of, it was ritualistically erased, transforming him from a man into a perpetual cautionary tale. This case serves as a timeless, chilling warning, especially relevant today in our age of ruthless power plays and digital overconfidence. It teaches us that when you confront a force dedicated to absolute secrecy and survival, the terms of engagement are no longer yours. The moment Hoffa entered that car, he ceded control of his life and his story. His punishment was not merely death, but the eternal public humiliation of having his fate known, yet his body forever hidden. The mystery continues to haunt us because it represents the ultimate fear, being utterly erased by an invisible hand, leaving nothing but questions behind. The final message is stark and terrifying. You may fight the system, you may fight the police, but you cannot fight the silence. And it is that silence, that terrifying lack of closure, that continues to define the legacy of Jimmy Hoffa. His body remains the ultimate prize, the definitive proof of a crime that history cannot close. The conclusion and call to action, CTA. This case, the vanishing of a powerful man in broad daylight, is the dark benchmark against which all American mysteries are measured. The betrayal, the brutal efficiency, the permanent silence, it is all a profound reflection of the true cost of chasing power within the shadows. But what do you think? What is the most compelling, the most realistic theory about where Jimmy Hoffa's body truly lies? Are you convinced by Frank Sheeran's confession? Or do you believe the mob's secret remains perfectly intact, waiting to be revealed by a new development? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective on this conspiracy, your voice against the silence, is what keeps the truth fighting against the darkness. If you dare to delve deeper into the cold, calculated betrayals of the underworld and the true horror that lurks beneath the surface of everyday life, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't let the silence win. This is Mr. Nightmare, and good night.